So joining me is Dr. Naomi Wood this time on the podcast. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you for having me, Wesley.
I'm so glad you could make some time to talk Philip Pullman over the summer here. You just said that you're on your vacation right now, so I do really appreciate it. And with that in mind, I guess, could you talk a little bit first about your work, your teaching, your writing, and how you got interested in Philip Pullman's work?
Um, I am a professor of children's and young adult literature at Kansas State University, so I've been reading and teaching this material for a long time. When I was a kid, one of my favorite series was the Narnia series.
Sure.
And so I loved that. Gradually became disenchanted with some aspects of it, but continue to think of it as, you know, sort of one of my cornerstone fantasy series. And when Pullman's series came out, I was just enthralled by it. I had already read his Sally Lockhart series, and I thought that was really great. But the Golden Compass / Northern Lights just blew me away, and I was just on tenterhooks for the next 7 years waiting for the other books to come out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And are you still following his subsequent releases as well, the Book of Dust?
Oh, yes. Yes. I was so excited when the Book of Dust came out this last fall. I had a group of students and other faculty. We went out to supper to talk about it one evening because we were all so excited to get it. So that was a lot of fun, and we're all looking forward to the next installment.
Yeah, definitely. I see that you've published quite prolifically, and at least some of that is about Philip Pullman.
Mm-hmm.
How did you make the jump from, being a lover of fantasy, and then maybe a sort of disillusioned reader of fantasy, back to doing this for a living? How did that come about?
I think, well, there's lots of ways of answering that question, but one way is to talk about the canon and canonicity questions that were percolating in the academy when I was in graduate school in the 1980s. A lot of professors of mine at the time, like Jane Tompkins, were radically challenging the way that literary value is set. And it opened a space for me to start thinking seriously about books I'd always liked, but didn't have any cultural capital with the academy or with other things. So I started being able to justify academically my interest in children's literature. And because I also am very interested in religion and theology, I find myself drawn to fantasy writers who are interested in dealing with those big issues about God and origins and where we come from and where we're going.
Well, so the canon and canonicity, could you elaborate a little bit? I haven't heard that latter term. I'm sort of familiar with the idea of a canon of great books and maybe even a canon of, authoritative texts or something like that. And I can see, issues with both of those senses of it. But yeah, I'm not familiar with your Professor Tompkins either.
Jane Tompkins wrote a great book on American sentimental fiction in the 19th century. And one of her basic questions was, what's so bad about sentimentality? And just the audacity of asking that kind of question and saying, so why should we dismiss it? Why should we categorically deny its importance, especially when so many ordinary people, ordinary readers, really respond well to that and have a certain amount of are motivated by it. And her big example is Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is admittedly sentimental, but was instrumental in creating a movement that helped lead in part to um, the abolition of slavery in this country. So, the way she posed that, canonicity then is the process by which something becomes canonized or how it is designated as canonical. And once you start looking at who decides, you realize that the same people who are in power in other ways are also in power deciding what
Mhm.
counts as good.
Right.
And so that being able to question that paradoxically then allowed me to start seriously examining some of the things that I was interested in anyway.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, I think I thought first of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I also thought of that part in Huckleberry Finn where they're sort of making fun of the very sentimental poetry that the one character's writing. So I could.
Oh yes, yes. It's a wonderful episode, and Twain is brutal, isn't
Oh yeah.
he?
Oh yeah.
He's completely brutal, and there's part of me that loves that too. You know,
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Terry Pratchett as
Oh
well
yeah.
as Philip Pullman. So I I admire and I enjoy people who can dismantle the pretensions of sentimentality as well as recognizing and being susceptible to its power. Um, the
Totally.
ending of some of Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, for example, are sentimental but so incredibly potent.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's clearly something like you said. These are very popular works in general, and so it's interesting then that in theory, we're in a sort of a political situation of democracy, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
people, what the people like is what is going to be in power and so forth. But then in practice, you see the same sort of thing happen there where actually there's very sort of entrenched forces that undermine that ostensible democracy.
Yeah,
Feel
yeah.
like do you feel like that has begun to shift in the approach to sort of non-canonical or previously dismissed areas of literature?
Definitely in the academy and the study of literature, it's happened. You now can go to a master's program like K-State or a PhD program to study children's literature in particular. That didn't used to be possible. There's more and more programs that are focusing on science fiction and fantasy and other genre fiction, so that genre fiction itself has become more acceptable. Some creative writing programs now are allowing their students to write genre fiction. That used to be pretty unusual and still is in a lot of places. So I think there's movement toward that. At the same time that you could say that the academy as a whole is also under attack.
Mm.
So at the moment where things are breaking apart and breaking open is also the time when the whole legitimacy of the institution is being called into question. So I don't know whether those things go together, or as long as we held to the great white male standard of literary canonicity, if that was going to sort of support the status quo. Now that that has broken apart, does that mean that the powers that be no longer value what the academy has to offer? I don't know.
Right, right, yes.
I'm not going to argue for a causal relationship, but I think it's interesting.
No, they definitely seem to be interrelated in some fashion. That yeah, so with the popularity, right, of fantasy, and the ways in which fantasy seems to kind of draw upon those grand narratives, like epics and myths and things. I see a kind of convergence of those two aspects, the thing that was held up as great in the past and the thing that is actually popular today. And maybe that sort of started with Tolkien or around that time, possibly. Lewis is definitely within that same conversation. And I think Pullman, as much as he vociferously contends that he is very different, he really does seem to fit along with those authors in that same space. And I guess that is kind of maybe a transition though with Pullman to sort of question the thing even as he applies its power to get to tell his story. It
Hmm.
gets me a little confused as I try to articulate that, but that's something I know that you are thinking about in your work, and maybe you could just kind of help me disentangle that a little bit.
Oh, I don't know if I can, but I'll try. Um, what I love about Pullman is that he loves all the old stuff,
Yeah.
all of these old stories and he digs into them and he discovers new ways of telling them. Um, there's an ancient tradition in Judaism called Midrash,
Mhm.
which is where you tell stories in order to interpret scripture.
Mm.
And if there's a gap somewhere in the Bible that doesn't really explain what was going on, you can tell a midrash to explain what's going on. And midrash is where some of his interesting names and characters are coming from, as well as other places. So that I think people have always wanted to do a kind of fan fiction, if you will,
Yeah.
of the major texts of our culture, and that includes the story of the fall. And so I would put Paradise Lost alongside his Dark Materials as both versions of fan fiction for talking about the world of Genesis.
Yeah.
um, I don't know if that's really answering your question, though. To get around that, I think um, Pullman is both hyper-canonical, right? He's sort of arguing for the value of epic, for example, um, and yet also hyper non-canonical because he's challenging the kind of critical modes of the contemporary moment where elite literary organizations stress um, realism or experimental fiction or other kinds of counter narratives to, well, maybe not counter narrative, but ways of undoing and challenging narrative expectations. And Pullman's like, no, we need a good story.
Yeah.
We need something that speaks to us where we're at, and something that um, explains the big stuff in the world to us. And he says, and I like this about him, and here again he's like Lewis, is that sometimes children's stories are the best stories for talking about the big ideas.
Right. Right. Yeah, that is very helpful. I think actually, I know I sort of lobbed a really tricky sort of curveball there. So let me try to ask a simpler version of it, I guess. And I really like that idea of interpretation taking the form of a story. I think that's a really interesting way to think about maybe what Pullman's up to in some of his fiction, even. But what do you think of his theory of authorship? And how that enters into this question of canonicity and grand narratives and things. He talks about how he is at once sort of the tyrant. He gets to decide what happens in the story, and yet he also talks in other places about how and this is very Lewisian, I guess. He has to follow the story. It sort of leads him, and he is its servant. He needs to kind of allow it to unfold in the way that seems natural, rather than forcing it in a way that he might prefer, think that would be, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I'd take that back to Plato, right?
Mhm.
Where inspiration is something you are to become a poet, you have to be open to the divine madness of inspiration. And so you can't necessarily control what it is that you want to say, if it's going to work as a story. So yeah, I think all of us writers sort of have to deal with that paradox that on the one hand, we have to be in control of what we're writing. We have to work on our craft. We have to structure and edit and express our ideas in the best possible ways. But oftentimes, if we let that editing superego function override the id, and the id is what sort of gives it, I don't know, the potency and the color that it needs to be a good argument or a good story.
Yeah, I think maybe that's sort of what's deficient. I don't know. I used to teach writing at the high school level, and maybe there's just too little id, and sometimes in what, students are writing, they think they have to just sort of follow a certain formula, and they don't get passionate about the material the way you might like. But
Yeah. Well, and there's also that the challenge of how do you, I think the appeal of a fairy tale or an epic is that you kind of have the structure already so that you can put your own stuff in it. And there's a wonderful image Madeleine L'Engle uses in A Wrinkle in Time, where she has one of the Mrs. W characters, I can't remember which one, but she talks about how a sonnet has a particular form,
yeah,
but that you can put anything into that form. And I think that's often what's really useful about these inherited forms that we've got, is that, yeah, you can take this inherited form, but then you can really mess with it. Like Chino Miéville does in On London, when he makes the sidekick the main character, and completely demolishes the whole idea of the chosen one.
mm,
But he needs that structure in order to demolish it. And so I see that as how authors are both sort of indebted to their traditions, indebted to their genres, but also able to make decisions about what they do and do not want to happen within those spaces.
yeah. Well, so there's a kind of conscious subversion going on there, a disobedience, right, to take the kind of
Mm-hmm.
archaic language or whatever. But then there's also this unconscious element, and I guess I don't know enough about the Freudian or where it stands at these days, like whether it is totally unconscious or not. But anyway, there's that thing that, yeah, seems to sort of be outside of your control, which is maybe the really interesting thing, that finds a
Mm-hmm.
place within these structures, right? So they do seem to be sort of interrelated again. That consciousness question is another one that Pullman seems really interested in, and I think speaks to in a really interesting way, especially once you start to unfold all of the different aspects of dust, right, in his
Yes.
cosmos. Have you got a good lead on what dust is, and how to think about it in terms of human consciousness or superhuman consciousness? I don't know.
Uh, I love I love the idea of dust,
Yeah.
and I love what he does with it in the third volume in the Amber Spyglass, where dust is sort of what makes the universe, and it's what makes angels, and it's attracted to humans, and it's attracted to anything that wants to figure stuff out. I love the idea that consciousness is the product of evolution and the attraction of symbiotic elements from all over space,
Yeah.
um, and that has some, I don't know, there's some scientific justification for that when you hear some astrophysicists talking about how the reason we have red blood is that that's part of uh, dead stars, whose residue creates iron, which ends up in our bloodstream. I mean, it's pretty wacky cosmic stuff, and dust works for me that way. That it's not in and of itself consciousness, but that it is attracted to and is becoming consciousness,
Mm.
so that it's part of our connection with all of, for lack of a better word, and this is really begging the question, creation, sort of all of the universe, that this is part of how we engage and interact with the universe.
Yeah, yeah, that aspect of it as a an attractive force has, I think, some interesting echoes from a kind of medieval worldview, like in I don't know, Dante or something, right? Where love is the thing that sort of like keeps the cosmos
Uh-huh.
going. It's interesting, I guess, the ways in which Pullman takes from and adapts all of this kind of older material, and yet also, he does have a certain interest in really modern science too, like
Mm-hmm.
right there, like the sort of astrophysics and what he calls experimental theology in Lyra's world.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of mashup of those two, forms of knowing, I find to be really interesting in his writing. I know some people go so far as to make the case that he's really writing science fiction actually, and I don't know really
Hmm.
how far to go with that, but it is interesting that that's another way in which he's kind of breaking down sort of genre expectations or something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the dust question is one that I really like to ask and think about, but the kind of corresponding question with that is, of course, about demons, right? Which are sort of the great idea that Pullman, holds up as original as sort of his great insight as he's written,
Mm-hmm.
that gets the story to kind of hold together. So as far as demons go, um, there's a few interesting things about them, but one is that they seem to represent this kind of problem of consciousness within different characters, and in different worlds they do so in sort of different ways. Like in Lyra's world, they're visible. In our world, they are invisible normally, but maybe not entirely. um,
Mm-hmm.
so as far as the demon as a part of people, but also sort of a guardian spirit sort of thing, um, I wonder how that might connect with the problems of adaptation, of consciousness, of this like connection to the world, in some maybe religious sense even. Um,
Mm.
I know that it's a sort of also just a really good way to tell a story, right? To get to have a character to be able to sort of talk about what's going on in their own mind. So as you think about the demons, what sorts of things do you sort of latch onto there as
Mm-hmm.
being worth further delving into, academically, or just, I don't know,
Uh-huh.
readers?
Um, the demons are wonderful, and I'm not sure that I understand all of their implications,
Yeah.
but here's where I think Pullman seems to be drawing at least a little bit on Jungian psychology, as well as um, the Platonic idea of the tripartite soul,
Yeah.
because there's this notion of the anima or the animus, depending on your gender,
Yeah.
and how the demon is, generally speaking, the opposite sex of the person who whose demon they are.
Mhm.
That they are sort of an emblem of the way that we are both divided and complete.
Right.
that we can have arguments in our heads between different aspects of ourselves. The old cartoons would set it up as a devil on one side and an angel on the other.
Yeah.
um, Pullman makes it a much more appealing and I think more human, paradoxically, emblem by having it be a familiar, an animal spirit that both expresses your identity but also provides you with an opportunity to push back against an aspect of yourself in a more material, concrete way than perhaps we are able to do when we're just arguing in our own heads. um, the demons are just such a wonderful conceit. I think it's one of the most attractive things about that first book. It's what the idea that we would not have the same experience of loneliness because we would always have a companion with us.
Mm-hmm.
And Lyra's first impulse when she hears of creatures without demons like the bears is they must be so lonely, right? And so that sense of being your own company perhaps is one of the most one of the appealing things about demons. But then you started your question with asking about conscience and consciousness, and it's sort of interesting that the demon embodies both of those things. It's both supposed to be a conscience in the sense that it's your what the old Victorian books used to call your inward monitor, your voice of ethics and morality, but also what might egg you on or guide you or offer another perspective or allow you to explore different aspects of the same problem. So it opens up the possibility for a more deconstructed notion of the self than perhaps we are inclined to do if we think of ourselves as sovereign individuals.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm thinking about, so in one of in the new book, I guess there's at least one character who's got a whole flock of butterflies for a demon, right? And so I feel like Pullman himself is still sort of exploring all the
Yes.
implications of, having a familiar spirit in whatever way it's manifesting. And she's like a sort of a fairy queen, actually, right? She tries to steal the baby Lyra. Spoiler alert. But there's some,
well, Bonneville is another really interesting one. I am just terrified by Bonneville, and
really,
he is so the scenes where he is so overtly in conflict with his own demon are so disturbing.
sadomasochistically.
Yes. But also because of the gendered nature of that interaction, it's to me even more troubling because he's not just beating an animal or an aspect of himself, he's beating a female aspect of himself, like when he beats the hyena. It's just, I haven't quite worked out what I think about it, but it's clearly a more audacious and less comforting notion of what a demon might mean for you than some of the earliest renderings where he was saying, well, it's just a way of understanding who you are, right? And that great conversation that Lyra has with the old shipman on the boat where he says, well, you get what you get, and if you don't like it, well, tough, because that's who you are.
Yeah, I find it really interesting how, well, a couple of things, as you study a living author, it's always kind of tricky because they'll come out with a new book that'll, completely undermine some great theory you've got going. On the other hand, there's this danger of taking the things that characters within the book say as if they're, speaking the author's mind in some sense. And I think Pullman does an interesting job of kind of distancing himself from certain aspects of what's in his books, while at the same time, really owning that he's got an intention with what he writes, has a moral kind of crusade that he's on in his fiction.
Right. Well, and he is continuing to follow the story, isn't he? He is not letting his inner tyrant take over completely, in that he is trying to follow the logic of what it means, what it might mean for different sorts of people to have demons.
Yeah, have you had a chance to look at his collection of essays that was released kind of at the same time as the new book? It was called Demon Voices.
I have it on my shelf, but alas, I have not yet looked at it.
Okay,
It's on my list.
right on. Yeah.
Is there a particular essay you would recommend?
I read I've read it through a couple times, and there's one big absence in the book actually that is his sketch, his autobiographical sketch that used to be posted on his website. I was really hoping that that would make it into the book, and that there might be more stuff about his work as a teacher, which he talked
Uh-huh.
about in an essay, because I'm very interested in that side of things, like the role of stories for education, basically, and sort of like how you can get more pleasure, in formal schooling, if that's even possible. But so there's a little
Yeah.
bit of that stuff in other essays. There's one called "Let's Write It in Red" or something like that that was new to me and that I really enjoy and have gone back to.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it just is really nice to have like an edited version of a lot of stuff that you might have been able to find, online or in bits and pieces elsewhere of, different speeches
Yeah.
and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, I recommend it. I bring it up just because it's it's this other sort of channel of his creativity. All of these speeches, all of these essays and things that he clearly puts a lot of time and effort into, alongside the the work of his own storytelling. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I wonder. I guess partly from your vantage point of reading a lot of criticism and theory and things about Pullman. Is there particular work out there, either book length or essays or monographs or whatever, that you'd really recommend as having uncovered something and maybe shown a real interesting way of reading Pullman?
Well, I think you can't go wrong with the collection that came out many years ago now, the His Dark Materials Illuminated,
Yeah,
edited by Millicent Lenz and Carol Scott. That's just a very good collection of a lot of different strong essays. I haven't read anything really mind blowing recently.
yeah,
Um, I think people are probably waiting until he's got more of the second trilogy out, the Book of Dust trilogy out, before they commit themselves. I get this sense, but I'm hoping that I start seeing some essays come across my desk that are about the new stuff that's going on.
yeah.
Um,
I haven't read any either about the new books in particular, and I'm
it's
curious.
still early, right? It usually takes a couple years for stuff to appear in print after, you know, I mean, unless it's blogged or
Yeah,
immediately electronically posted.
yeah. You also mentioned his Sally Lockhart work
Hmm.
earlier, and I read that a while ago, and I've been meaning to reread it. I'm curious too about sort of that sort of Victorian detective story-esque thing that he does, that he seems to love. He seems to want to incorporate. I feel like the Bonneville character in a weird way is kind of a version of that, actually.
Oh yeah, you're right. I think.
Yeah, he's like a
Yeah, he's very steampunky before steampunk was a thing.
right.
Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if he again is like sort of consciously trying to uh, invent something or do something with genre, or if it's just that that's the kind of thing that comes out of the reading and the, I don't know, the experience that he's had. But yeah, is there good writing about the Sally Lockhart books? I haven't actually investigated this myself.
Oh, I'm feeling like I haven't done my homework, but I can't recommend anything
That's okay.
off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
No, no worries.
But I would say go to Project News and look at what's being published in uh, Children's Literature Association Quarterly, The Lion and the Unicorn, Children's Literature, and Marvels and Tales. and generally good stuff is showing up there. If it's being written about Pullman, it's the odds are it's going to show up there.
Hmm. Yeah, that so those things to get involved with writing academically, it seems almost everyone seems to, be a professor at a university. But what would you say about like just kind of opening up a bigger audience for this kind of writing, or casting a wider net.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there's pros and cons, but you I'm sure have seen a lot more. It seems like you have read just about everything that's been written about Pullman at this point. So what is your kind of takeaway from where things come from as to the quality of what it's going to be?
Well, there's a really strong fan component that I don't think you can overlook today, where there's such smart people working on blogs and responding to new work
Mhm.
uh, in that context. I think what fan work is really good at is dealing with the textures and uh, quiddities of a work.
Mhm.
Fans are, as you know, I think you and I are probably on the same page here. You delight in knowing the really obscure details and ferreting out the really um, obscure references and that kind of thing. And there's a certain triumph when you finally figure out this
Yeah.
one question that you had that you would love a footnote for, right?
Yeah.
So there's that kind of pleasure in digging into the text that I think fans are particularly good at. I think what academic writers do really well is start setting that pleasurable investment in the text in conversation with larger conversations that are going on.
Mhm.
So whether it's questions about theodicy or child rearing or genre or um, psychology, academic writers are used to sort of fitting this into questions about why we write what we do and what sticks and what's important and what is value, what is morality, what is the good.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what academic writers excel at.
That sort of comes back to that question about the canon in a way, right? Sort of like
Mm-hmm.
establishing a sort of context of or a kind of conversation between books that are um, really sort of showing us something that otherwise we would be missing, or that it would behoove us to know about. Um, I wonder about the outlook then for the study of Pullman. So, have you also had a chance to teach his work in an academic setting, and or are you kind of like scheming about ways you might be able to do that? How that would fit in? Uh,
Yeah, I've twice had the opportunity to teach a class structured around Pullman, and it was so much fun. Um, I called it Innocence and Experience.
right.
And we basically spent the entire semester talking about all of Pullman's inspirations
Yeah.
and then ending with Pullman and where he was going from there. And so we started with Genesis, and we started with some of the early Hebrew and Christian responses to Genesis, and then moved into Paradise Lost and William Blake, and took it all the way to the 21st century. And students loved it. I mean, they were interested in the sources. They were interested in the ways that those sources look different once you see them in this context, not of here's what you have to believe, but look at all the different ways that people have responded to this very simple story,
Mm.
right? And so that became a really wonderful way to talk about not only different ways of reading Genesis, but also different ways of reading Pullman.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so you included, I assume, the Kleist essay in there too, right?
Yes.
What do you
Mm-hmm.
make of that? That's such a strange. I've not read any more of Kleist beyond that, but it's such a weird little uh, dialogue, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
and there's of course the bear. You know, he takes that whole cloth and the fencing with the bear
Mm-hmm.
thing. But how do how do you make sense of that essay? Have you got a good read on that?
um, I think the essay is talking about something slightly different from what Pullman
Hmm.
does with it, which is fine. You know, Kleist is doing one thing and Pullman is doing another. But it seems to me that what really lights his fire there is that notion that once you've left this state of grace of the unself-consciousness of childhood, you can't ever get that back. And so you have no choice but to go forward.
Mhm.
Now, for Kleist, I think he interprets this as a kind of tragedy. You know, it's an existential tragedy that this is just the way life is. So you just got to go forward. Um, and some of us may get to the divine um, uh, place implied by that full circle metaphor that Kleist uses, but that is clearly something that's only going to happen after death. You know, that it's not something to be expected in this life. Pullman, on the other hand, chooses to read that as a really optimistic and to use a buzzword, I suppose, an empowering metaphor for why we shouldn't give up once we lose our childhood unself-consciousness. That consciousness in itself is a gift and something to be treasured and um, harnessed and worked through and trained and uh, fed. I'm not sure. I'm realizing that the words that I'm using here might take us back to the tyrant image that we started with, the theory of authorship. So do you harness consciousness? Do you train it in an abusive way, like a bad dog owner?
Right.
Or is it something that is nurtured pleasurably, worked out, sort of like training for a triathlon or something? Is it something that um, allows us to regain that grace only through the kind of intense, focused, inspired effort that a dancer does to become a really good dancer, or a painter does to become a really good painter? That it's this combination of inspiration again and discipline.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That aspect of sort of apprenticeship and dedication to the craft, right? That's another
Mm-hmm.
thing I think Pullman is really strong on as far as, you know, what he does as a writer is just work really hard, which doesn't always look like much, right? He might just sort of be sitting there fiddling with stuff at his desk or like leafing through papers or whatever, but that he is like, you know, putting in the time and that is like really a valuable um, work essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you've got to do the scales
mhm.
to stretch your voice and strengthen your voice in order to sing the aria,
Yeah.
or whatever it is.
Well, cool. Well, so what are you working on these days? What is your current project or your kind of your outlook here as you get ready for another year of school coming up?
Ah, well, I'm working on two things right now. I'm working on an edited collection of the cultural history of the fairy tale in the long 19th century.
Hmm.
So I'm working with a bunch of authors generate a view of what is happening in culture and fairy tale during the 19th century. And then I'm also working on a chapter on children's literature and religion for another edited collection. And then at the back of all of this is a book project that I've been working on for a very long time, which is thinking about how children's fantasy from the 19th century to now is reinventing God in different ways. And so, of course, I'm including Pullman in that, but I'm also really interested in Terry Pratchett and Diana Wynne Jones and Charles Kingsley, George MacDonald, and of course C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien.
Yeah, that's quite a fascinating project. I mean, I could see why it might take a while. But the only Diana Wynne Jones that I'm familiar with, unfortunately, is the animated version of Howl's Moving Castle. Have you had a chance to look at that?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it's lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very Miyazaki.
Very much so.
They share a kind of quirky sensibility, Miyazaki and Diana Wynne Jones. So I can see why they go together well, but also it's very, very different from a lot of what she works with.
Yeah.
She's got her own sensibility that is definitely not Miyazaki, and I'm not being very concrete. You'll just have to read some of her stuff and find out for yourself.
I certainly would like to. I know you brought her into a pretty short essay that I was able to find on your academia page, actually, about sort of the role of Eros in.
Yes.
And she came out looking like a really amazing author, so I really need to read her
She
stuff.
is.
Yeah.
She totally is.
So I'm behind on my reading of that. I need to get to that.
We all are. We are all always already behind.
So I think that's the last thing I would say, I guess, about the canon is like, ideally it's a way to sort of get a sense of what you should spend your time reading, right? Like when you boil it down, like I feel like that's kind of what education is. It's like a prescription of like, you have only so much time, so use it well. Like here's the best things to look at. And I know I'm aware that that's got to be a very outmoded, viewpoint, but in some sense, that seems like sort of the human condition, right? We're limited. We've got only so much time to do stuff. So
Yeah.
how do you kind of, I don't know, manage that the deconstructed world?
The way I manage it is I try to read stuff I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
So, for example, I just in the last year finished the N.K. Jemisin Broken Earth trilogy.
Everyone tells me this is so
It's
good.
so good. It is so good.
Okay.
And things like that where people whose opinions I trust say you really need to read this. I really need to read that.
Yeah.
I just this summer read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sowers. Oh, it's another just amazing piece of literature that does things that I think Pullman doesn't do so well, which is engaging with questions of race and racism in really smart and interesting ways. So yeah, all you can do is just try to keep reading as much as possible, right? Because you're never going to read it all. But for me, a couple of years ago, I was talked into writing some chapters for in-house Bible textbook for our Bible class in our department. And I probably shouldn't have agreed to do it because I had so many other things I should have been doing instead. But it was so much fun to just read and dig into what people know and think about the past and the history of the Bible and how it was written and what we can and cannot know about it, and the differing opinions that different confessions have about particular episodes. It was just the greatest thing ever. So I think you got to just go with what you love, right? You've got to go with what makes you excited to read some more,
Yeah.
whatever that is.
Yeah, I feel like Pullman's work, far from making me, more of an atheist or whatever, has made me more interested in all the sources you mentioned, like the Bible, Milton, Blake. And so it's interesting to kind of do this like that circle from Kleist, right? You start with Pullman as a kid, in my case, or with the Narnia books or whatever it is as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of is the gateway that leads you into all this other, great stuff. And of course, there's other things that are, I don't know, in that same conversation that need to be sort of held up and brought to the fore, right? The Butlers and the Jemisons and all of that as well. But it's this kind of great, I don't know, like yeah, this push and pull at the same time that you get
Mm-hmm.
forward into the future, the progress, and back into the past and all of its mysteries and yeah,
Yeah.
it's just,
I think the most valuable thing that Pullman does in that regard is by making us confront those old texts in a new way to make us realize that we're not as sure about what's in them as we thought we were.
uh-huh, uh-huh. They're very Platonic or Socratic approach, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, I'll look forward to hopefully talking to you again in the
Yeah.
future, if that's all right. This
That
was
was a pleasure. It will be a pleasure.
it's been very fun, and thank you again. I'm very grateful for your time.
Thank you.
I'll let you go.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.